This is the Chandler Museum. This is Mitt Johnson, president of the museum, the Chandler Historical Society. We have met here in the corner building of Miss Con Wilkins. This is February 1963. I'm president of the society this year. We have guests this evening. There's 29 members present. We have guests, Mrs. Blanche Brunt Wagner from Kansas City is here with her mother, Ms. Alma Brunt. We also have a special guest, a very dear friend of ours, who's a pioneer of Lincoln County, who made the run in Sac and Fox Agency in 1891. Mrs. Harriette Gilstrap is our guest this evening, and she is going to tell you her experience when she made the run near Sac and Fox. I'll present to you now Mrs. Harriette Gilstrap.
Land that was to be open for settlement, and worked on that all of the summer before. And the country opened in September 21. Am I right about
91.
91. And I had not been out to the place that I took, but I knew where I wanted to go. And so my father was to give the signal for the people that were lined up on the Creek County line. And he held my horse so that I couldn't go before the other people did. And there was a young man at the agency that was after the same place that I wanted. And he had a running horse from Guthrie, hired it for that time. And I was going on our own, on Mama's and my horse. And old Wallace was his name. Well, Papa just held onto my horse's head until everybody had gone. And I knew then that the young man would get the place. But I started out, and my horse was a running horse. And Papa said to me, now you stay in the road. Don't you go off of the road any time till you get to the place. So I minded him. And there didn't seem to be anyone there. Of course, there was 160 acres, and it could have been on it. But I jumped off of the horse and set my stake. And it was a very, very hot day. And the water was just running off of my horse. And I had a flannel cloth there, and I was rubbing him down. And the young man came in from the south onto the place, and he says, I got lost. So I got it after all, and I was awfully glad. And my brother took the place just across the section line. And the girl that he married afterward, Cosette Stratton, took the place east of him. And Roy Hoffman took the land that was on the west of me. And a man by the name of Bill Briscoe from Guthrie took another place right there. So we had quite a colony. Well, you know what the rule was, that we had to live on the place. Well, of course, I couldn't live there because I was going to teach there at the agency at that time. But I got permission from the government that I could go on Saturdays. And there was an Irishman was working for my father, and he was very much interested in me, and he went down there and built a little one-room house, just as cute as a bug, and a little front porch, and just finished awfully nice. Of course, it wasn't finished on the inside. And I furnished it with had a little bit of a cook stove and some chairs and a bed. Well, I went down every Saturday. And then in 6 months we had to live on the place before we could prove up. Well, when that day came, I was on the place, and I was hem-stitching a sheet, sat by the window, and a man came up with a gun over his shoulder. Well, I was all alone. There wasn't anyone I could call, nor anyone near me at all. And I was terribly frightened, but I got up and locked my door and took a butcher knife in my hand, and he came up and looked in the window and walked around the house. I could hear him because I had some shingles piled up out there. But that's the last I saw of him. He didn't come in, but I didn't get out. I didn't unlock the door or move out. And my brother and Roy Hoffman came that night after dark. And that was a great relief to me. Then I went to Chandler to prove up on my place and paid 25 cents an acre for it. Doesn't that sound awful?
Yes, it does.
Did you mean you went to Guthrie or Chandler?
Chandler.
Guthrie. I came to Chandler, but I went to Guthrie
Yeah.
to prove up on the place. And Lee had to go, my brother Lee had to go to Oklahoma City.
Wasn't this near Sac and Fox?
Yes, about 3 miles south of Sac and Fox, 3 or 3.5. It was on the Deer Creek.
Ms. Gilstrap, tell us about staying all night at the Indian Spring.
Oh, that was when the town of Chandler was to open. It was to open on the same day that the rest of the country was opened. But for some reason or other, and I've forgotten what it was, they put it off for a week at least. And so I went on to Guthrie.
But you stayed all night in a tent down there.
Yes, I stayed all night at the Big Spring. Big Spring, was it, or was it
Indian.
Indian Spring? And we had tents to sleep in, and Cosette and I had a tent, and Keokuk and William Herr, who was the Baptist minister at the agency, slept in the tent next to us. And Keokuk snored so loud that we couldn't sleep.
Was that Moses Keokuk?
Was it what?
Was it
Moses
Moses
Keokuk. And the next morning we went on to Guthrie. And then I came back for the opening of Chandler and was here. It opened at noon, and I got in about 8 o'clock that morning. And just as the town was opened, I was taken with a chill. Oh, I was too sick to even hold my head up. And I had a stake to set, and knew where the main street was, and I was going to get a place right by my brother. And I think that it was in the block where the Rexall drugstore was years ago. And Lee got his lot. and some man got the other one. And I wanted to buy it. I could buy it for $50. And the boys said, no, don't take it now. You can get it. He wants to get away from here, and he'll sell it for just little of nothing. You just wait. So I waited. And they said, now at midnight you'll get it for just whatever you want to pay. Well, I didn't want to wait, but I did. And at midnight the man was gone and had sold the lot for $50. So I never got that, for the fact that I was sick. Went on to Guthrie, and we got numbers in Guthrie, and my number was way up there. I'd have to wait several days before I could file. And I was taken very sick. The doctors said I had typhoid fever, but I did not. I just had chills. I had 3 hard chills in 36 hours. And so I was pretty sick. And Mr. Barnes, who had the filings, came to the house and took my filing when my number was called. He took it at noon when he could get away. I thought that was just wonderful. A man that had so much to do and so many people to wait on, and that he would come to the house and take my filing was something.
Was that the filing for a city lot or for the farm?
Farm.
For the farm.
Mm-hmm.
I was under the impression that you could only get land.
What is it, Faye?
I was under the impression that you could get land only once, and you got the farm, and then you spoke of getting a lot.
Yes, we could have.
Go as many times as there were openings?
It wouldn't have made any difference. I could have gotten a lot if I'd been able to get it. Get just a lot here would be all.
You didn't get the lot though, did you?
No, I didn't get the lot.
Took the chills.
I got the chills.
Well, could you have gotten a lot too as well as a farm?
Yes.
You could.
Yes.
That's what, how did you go to Guthrie? Did you walk or ride or take a
Went in
airplane?
a
Stagecoach?
stagecoach.
What year did you come to Chandler then, Mrs. Gilstrap?
Well,
To stay, I
you
mean, to
mean,
live.
What year did I marry?
Uh-huh.
In 1899.
1899. And you moved to Chandler then, you and Mr. Gilstrap.
Came right to Chandler.
And why don't you tell them something about your time in the beginning of the old Sac and Fox agency when they had all the Indians there?
Yes.
Because that was there, and I used to go over there.
Yes, the Io and Zoe
Yeah.
and the 2 Hoyts and Mr. Brunt, Mrs. and you came along. We had a wonderful society there.
Oh, yeah.
And we had big dinners. We had a big dinner on Thanksgiving and had a dance. And
It was all day.
seems years and years ago now. And it was, too.
As to what the population of Sac and Fox was at that time.
Sac and Fox.
What was the population of Sac and Fox that time, you remember?
Well, I don't know. There were 2 stores and about a half a dozen houses. They were just the employees.
Just the people that worked there.
And of course the school, there was 50 or 60 children. There were no families excepting government employees.
I remember the Indians coming over there and peeking in Miss Confidence windows and doors and sitting on the porch and scaring the life out of me. They were blanketed.
Yes. Yes, they were the real Indians at that time.
Ms. Gilstrap, I heard you tell once about teaching the Indians the Lord's Prayer, and they said it back to you, the Lord is my shepherd.
No, that was one little girl,
Oh,
and she was the youngest child in the school, and of course couldn't talk English to amount to anything. We all of us tried to teach her, and she came into the kitchen, and I asked her what that was. There was a can of lard there, and she says, "Oh, that's the Lord is my shepherd."
May I ask you about Harry Gilstrap? When did he start the Chandler News?
In 92.
In 92.
Mm-hmm. He just graduated from Manhattan College,
In
and
the early part of 92, wasn't it?
yeah. And he came directly down here after that.
He did. And started a newspaper
Mhm.
with his sister Effie.
Yes.
We have all of the Chandler News papers in microfilm from 1893 clear through, when is the last one? 1915 or 16? Someplace in there.
Oh, it was later than that, I think.
Well, I think we have all the microfilm.
And are the papers have they been?
Yes, those big. May I tell you this? He and his sister went to Kingfisher in April of 18.
Following is more information from an interview with Mrs. Harriette Gilstrap made in Chandler in 1963.
You know, in the trees, you know.
On the horse.
On the horse and then trailing me.
That would have been a lot earlier than that.
Yeah.
Well, just go ahead and tell us.
That's hard to do, isn't it, Miss Gilstrap, just to start out and tell?
Well, she said you told us this quite a bit. About getting ready for the run. You start out with it before the run, and then just tell us.
I had worked all summer on, you see, I'm forgetting, on making blueprints of the Sac and Fox Agency. And in that way, I knew where I wanted to go to get a claim. And when the agency opened, that country papa was the agent, and he was out to give the signal at noon. And this place that I wanted was 5 miles from where we were, from the Creek Nation, where we were to go in. And I had a running horse, and I was on it, and Papa said that I could not leave where we were until everyone had gone. He stood there with his gun and gave the signal, and the people rushed across the line, and he held my horse so that I couldn't go.
Oh, yeah.
And after they were all over the line, he let me go. And my orders were that I was to go by road. I couldn't go through a shortcut because there was no road. And he said that I'd be brushed off in the timber. So I was only, and it seems to me I was about 15 minutes getting to the place. And there was a young man had got a running horse from Guthrie, and he was going for the same place that I was. And I got off my horse and looked around, and I didn't see any sign of him anywhere. He had checked on trees to go through a shortcut.
Marked.
So I set my stake and was wiping the lather from my horse when he came from the south to where I was, and he laughed and says, "Well, I got lost." So I got the claim all right.
Well, now, if you got the claim, did you have to go to Guthrie or Oklahoma? Where did you go
I had
then?
to go to Guthrie to sign for it, but they were in another section, another place, and they had to go to Oklahoma City.
Well, how many runs was there, Miss Gilstrap? In this area? Now, was there one over there, and then one here at Chandler, and then one?
Well, this run at Chandler was
That was town side.
2 weeks later.
Later.
Well, now, was there just one into the territory?
What-
Into the Sac and Fox and
What
Iowa
did he
and
say?
Potawatomi?
Just one?
Just one. No, there was, well, the first run was to be the next week after the run over there
Oh.
for Chandler. And they found something wrong with it. I don't know what it was, but it was put off a week. So I went to Chandler, or went to Guthrie, and I couldn't file on my claim because I was late getting into Guthrie, and I was given a number. And on Sunday after, this was on Monday night, and on Sunday after that, I came over to Chandler for this opening. And I got here about 8 o'clock in the morning, and the town was to open at noon. And at noon I had a chill, awfully hard chill, and high fever. I couldn't even raise my head off the pillow. I had a stake already, and I knew just where I was to go, but I couldn't.
Well, that was for the town lot of Chandler.
Yeah, that was at Chandler.
Chandler. Well, now, Deb had told, and I don't remember anything about in the run, one of the runs, that he crossed the river. Would that have been the Cimarron? Where did they? Do you know?
When they came from Guthrie and coming this way, what river did they cross?
That's Cimarron.
Oh, I don't know the names of
It was
them.
the Cimarron one that Miss
I guess it was the
That's the
Cimarron.
only one that I
Did
know.
they have people all over the whole, around the whole area that were running, and that different spots? There'd be a man that would fire the shot.
Yes,
I didn't understand
From
quite how.
From Guthrie
Mhm.
coming here.
Yes, there were a lot of people here, an awful lot of people.
Now, I don't mean for Chandler, I mean, but for farmland and like that. How did they run in for
Well, if they could get in and get to stake a lot, they could have it, of
was
course.
that? But that was a different run than the town site run, wasn't it?
Yes. Now, the run that they made for this county, for the farms, that was before the town site run, wasn't it?
No,
Wasn't it?
it was the town site run.
Well, then when they ran for farms out around here in the
Oh.
Kickapoo.
Oh, that was still later.
That's what it's called.
Kickapoo was opened
That's
still
what I-
later.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yes, they was two, yeah.
I don't know how much, I don't know now how much later, but it was quite a good deal later.
River that
I
time.
don't know.
Because,
Well, now, after you moved here, then they everything was brought in here from Guthrie. They had ox wagons and things like that, and hauled their furniture and everything. Guthrie was the main shipping point,
Yes.
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, tell something about the hauling and bringing things over. How'd you get your furniture to
Well, our
Sack and Fox?
furniture was all here before that because
I'm gonna set this up so I can watch it.
Well, how did you get it from?
well, covered the wagons.
I'm gonna ask you any questions I want to watch.
Because you can't go here, do it.
The furniture was all moved with covered wagons. And they were just 3 or 4 days getting, I guess nearly a week, getting from Oklahoma City to the agency with the things.
well, when they would haul the groceries, one wagon would go over at night and then start back early the next morning, and I think it would take them all day to get from Guthrie over here to Chandler.
Oh, it took longer than that at first.
It did. Was that?
We were 3 days getting from Oklahoma City to the agency. Of course, it was stormy and, we were delayed that way.
Ms. Gilstrap, did they, when they run for town sites, did they line up down by Deep Fork? I thought it was Bell Cow. I thought it was down here on the school land when they lined up to run for Chandler town sites.
Well, I don't know. We stayed all night out by the springs
Yeah,
and camped there by the springs.
that
That was outside of Chandler,
was there a bunch of people then all up south?
all up and down everywhere. And there were tents. And Cosette Stratton and I slept in one tent, and it was next to the one that Keokuk and William Hur had, and we couldn't go to sleep because they snored so loud.
That was all along 15th Green there.
The following is a discussion of cotton industry in Lincoln County, Oklahoma, given by George Dawson of Chandler in 1960.
Thank you, Mr. President and ladies and gentlemen of the Historical Society. In compiling a paper on Lincoln County for cotton, it isn't quite as easy as I anticipated at the start, and it's taken a good deal of time to regain some of these old copies that were made in the state libraries. What I mean is the letters that were written for this information has taken a good deal longer than I anticipated. Cotton in Lincoln County in 1891, of course, wasn't heard of, and until about 1893, according to our records, D.R. Owens at that time was probably the first man in that particular business. Cotton had become a very necessary product, and of course, all of the larger buyers of cotton in this part of the country were anxious to get as much ginning cotton as they were able to, And I thought at this time I might read a few lines from a contract of cotton, which will give you an idea of what the people that bought cotton were after. It's the delivery within the time that the contract was made was upon notice to the buyer as provided by the bylaws of the New York Cotton Exchange. This business of cotton was controlled in New York by bankers and cotton buyers, and these contracts were brought out about the 1st of April of each year as an estimate for the entire crop all over the world. And the cotton contracts were made out in 50,000-pound lots each, or about 100 bales. And these bales were about 500 pounds each. That is, all cotton then was bought on that particular idea of a grade of cotton which would be fair or poor according to the seasons of the year or drought or conditions that might make the cotton a little better in one year than another. Now, as an example of how cotton prices were controlled, and an awful lot of people and I've talked to in my experience has often wondered why cotton would be 10 or 12 cents in New York and back in this country maybe 4 or 5 cents. It's a rather unusual thing, but in 1907 there's a banker in New York had been written a letter from the Cotton Exchange in London. And of course at that time London and England was the major mills. They produced all of the cotton cloth as far as big amounts. And so they naturally had what we call a service, or people that were out into the cotton countries that compiled all the information every year and sent these data back to their mills for future buying. In this particular year, there wasn't anything very much of importance going on in the cotton buying, and the cotton price was about 9 cents. But at that particular time, someone had been in the southern part of the United States, and a very violent tropical storm struck the Gulf Coast and spread into the interior, covering the entire central portion of the belt, precipitating torrential rains, and with strong winds continued for several days. A cold wave followed upon this storm and resulted in official reports of frost in north central and eastern portions of the belt on October 10th and 11th. Now this letter, of course, was in September, and these floods and cold weather came in October. Well, there was naturally a sensational drop in cotton prices, an unusual gain in cotton prices on just very few lines of information that this party had sent back to his mills. The point I wanted to stress was that our prices back in this country were sometimes influenced by foreign countries buying cotton, and they controlled the major amount of imported cotton that America grew and exported. And in just continuing that as a basis of your cotton business, well, you can see that the reason for cotton being a major crop in the county immediately a necessity, because people back in, I presume 1893, there weren't too many well off, and perhaps didn't have too many places to go as far as entertainment, and had very little else to do but to farm, and this cotton then became a cash crop and has been referred to as the king crop of all agriculture, as cotton was king in the South. It naturally was made a part of this country. So I started in about 1894, and in 1900, all the cotton ginned in Lincoln County in Chandler was hauled to markets in Shawnee or Guthrie, and a little of it was hauled to Muskogee. But the major part of it was hauled either to Shawnee or Guthrie, and there are so many stories that perhaps your own memory can bring up a few that will not necessitate any elaboration on those long hauls that took 2 and maybe 3 days to go from here to Guthrie or from here to Shawnee with just a few bales of cotton, and then the buyers in these larger places would pay the farmer for his crop, and the farmer then would buy whatever needs he needed and haul back to his home. Well, that was taking quite a long time, since there weren't any roads in Lincoln County and trails were unmarked, and I'm pretty sure most of you can remember that even the old better way from here to Davenport in the early days was pretty much of a trail in between the old jack oaks that these farmers had to use. And they usually only had one wagon and maybe a team, and very few in these early days had any livestock to speak of at all. And of course, beyond my time, but I've been told a story that very many of our early day farms were farmed by oxen. And I remember that the lakes out east of town still had the large oxen that had the large wooden, well, I suppose a bow between their yoke, between their necks to pull the plows. And in the deep fork bottom section of Lincoln County, a lot of the ground was broken and the crops were broadcast or sown by hand. The cotton seed was just put in the ground on top of the surface, and a big heavy log was then drawn over this to cover up the cotton. And actually, our early day cotton wasn't what you'd call very modern farming or scientific, but the crops were made, and as far as records that we can find, our early day cotton crops ranged from a little over 7,000 bales in the very early days up to in 1905 and 6 about a little over 50,000 bales. So it didn't take long for cotton to become a very major crop. In about 1902, according to a story I was told by Mr. Ross Crane, there was a rather industrious buyer of cotton that was from Guthrie. He and his partner had a number of gins along the eastern or western part of the county, from Luther clear back up through Payne County. Well, at this particular time, the Frisco Railroad had been completed in Chandler through this area, and the Santa Fe Railroad had been wanting an outlet line through this for freight. And they had approached the Chandler citizens for right-of-way for this railroad, and they'd like to have had it free of charge, naturally. But the citizens of Chandler felt that since they'd had the Frisco Railroad here, and it served their purposes, they didn't see any reason to give away any more land, and they had been just recovering from the Frisco right-of-way proposition that followed along the same lines. But the Santa Fe group was pretty smart, and they approached this fellow Coyle and his partner and had offered a good deal of the lots and town sites along this railroad that would later be made town sites as they were laid out, if he were to acquire this right-of-way for the Santa Fe, and which all was done in time, and these smaller towns then sprang up all the way from Kendrick through to Meeker, and I believe, if memory serves me right, they had some headlines and advertisements in our papers over the state that intended to sell these town lots off to buyers with the promise that these towns would soon become a very large city or a metropolis of the Southwest as soon as the development occurred. Of course, none of that actually happened, but that's pretty much of the story of how these railroads started. Well, of course, that was very important for an outlet to the cotton industry in this area, but since the railroad had facilities to carry our cotton as it was baled back into the markets, it gave us a little better marketing ability for getting the money back into this part of the country sooner. Of course, about this time, after D.R. Owens had gotten his gin in operation about 1893, And there was one or two other gins started, and practically in operation the same year. A Mr. Herman is one of the gentlemen's names given in the early date, but very little other information was shown. But in this same item was that D.R. Owens' gin had been completed and was installing one more stand in their gin, which would bale 30 bales of cotton in about 14 hours. Well, of course, cotton was a very slow crop to take from the seed and put it back into the lint cotton as a bale. And this bale, of course, necessitated quite a bit of actual work on the part of the fruits that started the cotton through to put it into this bale form. And there was a good deal of machinery involved, and an awfully lot of fellows got hurt. Some lost their arms and others their life later in these very mechanical processes. As cotton was baled in 500-pound bales, they were tied with very heavy metal strips with this burlap wrapped around it to keep the cotton clean, of course. But it was also used, this burlap was used as a marker spot for the ginner, and he would put a date and the weight of the bale and the grade of the cotton. If the cotton were on a contract, as I pointed out before, they'd make a mark. This cotton was already sold, so it was sent on to the markets, and there wasn't anything more for the ginner then to worry about. But there was an awful lot of cotton that wasn't sold on contracts and had to be held over. And as each year the crops would keep coming in, and our cotton was increasing in its yearly output, these bales naturally would pile up, and you can remember yourselves how many blocks of cotton you would find after each season, all lined up in nice rows down around these old cotton gins. And in some of the larger marketing places, they'd just be big warehouses, probably a quarter of a mile long, just filled with bales of cotton, waiting for a better price. Of course, along about this same time, we've had a little knowledge of some of the earlier gins. There was a Rooney gin down marked at 15th and City Ranch. Well, of course, that was the way it was marked on the map, but that means it was right below town here, out toward Dave Diamond's residence, just over the city limits. I guess he did that to keep out of the taxation on it, because they were lessed a certain amount of money, of course, on these buildings, and there was a good deal involved in a gin. I think about $25,000 was minimum to put a gin into operation. Then there was the round bale gin, and this belonged to Gordon and Rooney, as they were related. Now, this round bale gin, if I can recall, had an axle or a spindle, you might call it, that wrapped the cotton around instead of square bale. It just made a nice round bale. And of course, to operate this process had to be pretty heavy, strong men to have to lift out the entire bale in this steel axle. And a good many times the cotton would stick on that steel bar, and there'd be maybe an hour or two getting that cotton off of that steel bar, and it slowed down the process so much that they finally turned this round bale gin into another. Then there was the F&M gin up here on 6th or on 7th, where the old light plant used to be, was run by Mr. Corley. That's Marion Corley's father. And the gin down here below, it's over on Keokuk, I believe they call it, 7th and Keokuk, was run by a man named Gow, or Gooch, or some such a name. I believe Mrs.
His name was Gooch.
Ragsdale told me that story. And he came down here and started that gin. Of course, now a lot of these gins didn't continue very long. As we've already found, from 1893 to about 1903, there were just a number of fellows that seemed to be fit for this type of work. Of course, in other towns that I haven't been able to explore fully, at Meeker, in the early days, about 1902, there was a fellow named Martin that had the original gin. And over at Stroud, I believe either O.T. Unglesby or the Hadleys were amongst the first ginners in Stroud. At Wilzetta was a Charles Meyer. And at Sparks was Wheeler Collier. And Prague was either this Leder or Jepson. Now, I'm not so sure about the Prague area because
Whitmore was one of the early
Whitmore. I didn't get that name, but I knew it was one of those gentlemen. At Rossville, there was a Graham Hall, and Midlothian, J. Todd. Now, those gins were just around this vicinity, is why I picked them up. And, of course, each cotton gin had to have a place to sell their seed and their lint. And the Cotton Oil Companies then had a mill at Stroud and a large mill at Prague and a large mill at Chandler. The original plant was built here in 1898, according to our record, and it employed about 50 men. Well, there was Harry Barksdale was manager about 1910. Of course, earlier than that, in 1898, was a gentleman named Culbertson, and he was followed by Mr. Burgess. That's Allen Burgess's dad. And then there was a Barksdale, and then Earl Shotwell came here from some other locality to run the mill for a number of years. And he was transferred, and I believe Albert Wright or George Sipes was kind of put in charge here until the mill was discontinued. Of course, this mill, being a rather important part of our local history, we naturally will remember that here's a little item. It was started with $50,000 capital and later increased to $75,000. And this Culbertson was president, and Fanny Filch's father was vice president, Charles A. Filch, with Peter S. Hoffman treasurer and Burgess secretary. Of course, this mill was located down here at the corner of town where the railroad had a spur, and near this mill was some large feeding pens for cattle, and these cattle were taken off of the train and shoved into these pens, and we had the nice spring water down there from the corner of town that was piped into this area, and they hauled their feed from this cotton mill once a day to feed the cattle that were then later sent into the markets into Kansas City. Of course, there were a lot of other little side issues of cotton going on all the time. In 1897, Lincoln County won first prize at Guthrie with their exhibit, which had cotton in their agriculture, and cotton was probably priced along about the same in it didn't vary too awfully much in this area. About 7.5 cents was pretty nearly standard price. And in 1902, cotton was bringing about 8 cents, and it increased about maybe 1 or 2 cents between 1902 and 1906. Went to 10 cents in 1906. In about 1905, this Todd gin that I spoke of down near Midlothian was located there, and this fellow named Todd sold this gin, to Mr. H.M. Johnson, banker here in Chandler. And Mr. Johnson needed a manager and gin operator, and he employed my father back about 1904 or thereabouts. And my dad had to start from here about 4 in the morning and drive Mr. Johnson's nice team of horses and buggy and all down there every morning that early to start to work. And of course in those days I had to work pretty late at night, and I think his day usually ended up about 11 in the evening. But I just thought I'd mention that as the number of hours that were put into this particular business. Didn't seem to be any end to the amount of work involved, but cotton being a cash crop and one of our major crops, it was natural that everybody applied their wholehearted effort to this particular business. And you could take, for instance, that the farmer had to get his seed in the ground at a certain time, and although he wasn't particularly interested in the weather, what was our weather lady's name over in East China? Ms. Schaefer, thank you, was called upon a great many of times every day as to what the weather conditions were. It was very vital to the buyers of cotton to know ahead what the weather trend was going to be. That doesn't seem very logical, but if you were to realize that letter written in 1907 clear across the world varied the price of cotton 2 cents just on account of a little torrential rain, you can understand why cotton was fluctuated so fast in the markets on account of those weather conditions. And even our mills here in Chandler, although they were small, they'd call Mrs. Schaefer about the weather reports every day to find out whether there was going to be dew or too much moisture, or whether there would be a drought. And those things.
In those days, George, excuse me,
that's
but
quite
that
right.
was Mrs. Tuttle. Mrs. Schaefer didn't take that.
Yeah, I believe it was Miss Tuttle. I believe it was. Yes, ma'am.
Charlie Curtis had it first, and his mother took it. She had it
Yes.
first.
Well, I thank you. I wasn't so sure, but I'm sure about Miss Tuttle. Of course, along with D.R. Owens as one of our major operators here in this particular area, there was this fellow, Mr. Coyle, W.H. Coyle, I believe it was, and an Abrahams from around Bristol that were large operators. That is, these gentlemen, D.R. Owens at one time was supposed to have had about 14 gins right through this area operating, as did Coyle and this gentleman from Bristol. Well, you understand these fellows all had to be out in very competitive form getting more farmers to plant cotton for their particular gins. And these ginners were pretty big men, and they had these contracts, as I mentioned, of 50,000 pounds of cotton were a single contract, and they'd naturally try to get as many of those as they could to sustain their business, and they'd naturally fight about the quarter of a cent in points that were involved on the price of cotton. Cotton has been a very unusual crop to follow on that account. You nearly have to study the basic reasons of cotton going up and down to understand why cotton has 4 different numbers generally in the price. As late as 1960, crop is priced at 34.02. The 02 on the end of that is money too, understand, but the fluctuation will always be after that decimal. 34 cents will probably stay a normal price for that cotton for a number of months, but the points that it goes up or down is the 02 or 05 is after the cents. And even that slight of fluctuation means quite a number of dollars in those large contracts of cotton. Of course, after the Frisco had been built here, they had a great number of things that, if I can just pick that up real quick, I believe in about 1950 5 or 6, the Frisco hauled something like 15,000 bales of cotton to the market, with 132 carloads of cottonseed meal, about 35 carloads of oil, and something in that neighborhood of cottonseed itself. So you can see they got away finally from the old bale wagon that we used to know of hauling the cotton from here to market on those long, slender, maybe 18-foot beam wagons with the large, wide steel rim wheels. And those fellows would have to load 5 or 6 bales. Couldn't haul many because the cotton weighed quite a bit. And they were on pretty sandy roads without very much maintenance. And they also had the hazard of being hijacked and waylaid and one thing and another, and the trip was pretty hazardous. So naturally everyone was very happy to get away from having to haul their cotton to market by wagon or take it on those bale wagons. Of course, in the early days, cotton being what it was, Saturday was naturally one of our big days in town. And everyone that I have talked to remembered that the cotton wagons would be lined up at the moment that the sun would come up. They'd be lined up blocks and blocks away from the gins. And I think there was a little story that one day in those early days that there was cotton being ginned down at the old Chandler gin company, or that square bale gin down by the depot, and the wagons had backed up clear up almost to the old post office hill. And someone thought that was a pretty good sight to photograph, but if I understand correctly, they called Mr. Lewis to take a picture of it, and he said, well, there's no real reason to coming down that far to get a picture of a lot of wagons on the streets, for his street out there was backed up farther than they were on Allison at that time. Well, it just indicates the number of people involved in bringing their cotton to market in those early days. And a note was made here that about $25,000 in those little cotton checks were cashed at our local merchants. And Mrs. Cunningham volunteered the fact that they had cashed quite a number of those during the early days themselves, so they remember. They didn't know how many, of course, but 25,000 was one of the days that they had here. Of course, since we didn't have any county agents until about 1916, a lot of these records are just picked up from papers and clippings that I've dug up just as a matter of curiosity on my own part. But in about 1920, we had about 4,550 farms, that's of 160 acres, in cotton. And that particular year was an enormous cotton yield year. And about that time the boll weevil began coming in, and it stained our cotton pretty bad. And of course that wasn't the entire reason that a lot of the cotton in 1920 was left in the field. I was talking to Mr. Crane, and he said the price had a lot to do with it, that our cotton dropped down to where it was hardly worth picking. Well, they had ginned 48,718 bales that year, but according to Mr. Crane, I can remember that the fields of cotton were still white even in December of that year because they hadn't been picked. And we had a good many of years like that where the price absolutely made it impossible to make any money on cotton as far as that particular year went. Some of our larger crop years, according to record, were 1906 and in 1920 and later in 1933. But since that time, and it begins to get into a, well, you just kind of call it a cycle of cotton. We've had bad years, drought, and we've had the boll weevil started to come in, and then we had a new type of agriculture introduced, and that was when our soil erosion became so apparent that the nearly all of our farms in Lincoln County were going to wash down the creek, that they had to do something about it. But that wasn't the entire real reason that cotton became controlled. We had surpluses in the United States far above our use, and we couldn't export enough cotton to balance our economy, so they had to start cutting acreage. Of course, that comes a little later on than these early days, but I wanted to begin stressing that point, that we soon were to run entirely out of cotton, as a lot of people remembered in this part of the country. And also the taxation has been a lot.
This tape will continue on the other side. This is a continuation of an account by George Dawson on cotton raising in Lincoln County, recorded in 1960.
Different than it was in the early days.
And we've had so many controls put on cotton that it started about 1932 that they were trying to control the cotton production in counties all over the state. And they brought that type of a bill to the farmer to vote on for allotment of acreage. So it was pretty hard to get Lincoln County started either way. They turned it down the first time it was introduced, but later adopted the acreage idea here because there was a government subsidy that allowed them about 16 cents a pound whether they grew cotton or not. That is, if they signed up for this particular
type of crop. Of course, there were other things going on along with that. You had your education of the younger folks into 4-H clubs that wanted to diversify this crop from row crops into something that the kids could learn to get a cash crop of something besides cotton. That was going on too, but also the government was trying to discourage too much cotton in Lincoln County on that account. If you might remember, I won't pass that picture, where do they call it, around to you folks, that you can get an idea or a glimpse of our streets of Chandler in those very early days. I had written a state for a little information which they have available, but at this time, according to their letter, it would be impossible without a great deal of research to develop production estimates for Lincoln County, since they develop all of their technical information on the state of Oklahoma. Early-day
records are available, but it would have taken them so long to get the information here, I just wasn't able to get it. But they sent me a very nice little booklet on cotton as to Oklahoma cotton, and I'm going to leave it with the Society. In 1910 census was Lincoln County. 9 had 99 folks. 9 had 99 folks. 130 acres in cotton. Production of 28,902 bales. Now this simply merits to most of us. I've been asked how many acres Lincoln County usually has. In cotton, and it didn't vary very much. Our least amount, of course, has been in the last few years. Something like 5,000 or 6,000 acres is all that's been in cotton since about 1945. But from about 1905 until about 1935, our acreage didn't vary a great deal, under 100,000 acres. This was 99,900 and some, so it was very close to the average of cotton acreage. Now cotton, of course, depended a great deal on the fertility of the soil, and in the early days a bale of cotton to the acre wasn't uncommon. And as a matter of fact, a great many of our farms, if many of you have any stories, we'd be glad to hear of. But I know of one particular party down on the old Guessman place that in one particular year grew and harvested, that is, baled 55 bales off of a little less than 80 acres. Of course, all of these farms were very fertile then, and naturally a bale to the acre wasn't uncommon. That's why we got such an awfully large crop of cotton in Lincoln County. But the soil began to wear out, and we began to have boll weevil infestation, and drought and other things naturally control cotton itself. It's a very hard plant to get through in some cases. And the lint yield dropped from about 215 pounds per acre then until at the present day, I think it's a little less than 50 pounds that you can depend on an acre of land growing. Now that means that an acre of land will only grow about 50 pounds of lint cotton, whereas in the early days it would grow 500 pounds. Now that's what's happened to your soil. So they had to start some sort of a program to prevent the farmer from this row crop year after year that was wearing the soil out. And of course cotton could be planted back on some of these old fallow fields right now that would grow a bale of cotton to the acre again. But that couldn't be continued more than a year or two without that land going back into some type of cover crop and fertilizing it and preventing that type of waste. As why cotton has been, was king in the early days. There just didn't anyone want to worry too much about the soil or anything that the future might have in store, because they didn't realize that. I was going to mention a little bit about Miss Kate Gordon. When she took that gin over from the round bale, of course the Rooneys and the Gordons were related in a manner of speaking, but Miss Kate Gordon, as I remember, was about the first lady that I ever knew of in the cotton business. But she had that gin down there under control year after year, and she would buy that cotton, sample it out of the wagon, give the farmer a quoted price, and if he liked it, he'd bring the cotton down to her, and she'd weigh that cotton as it came in on her scales, and it would be ginned. The bale would be weighed, and the old empty wagon weighed, and all of that transaction was made by Miss Kate Gordon. And that may sound like a very small item in a day, but when you have 50 or 60 wagon loads of cotton that have to be sampled and tested, and your own judgment is going to keep you in business, so you can understand how sharp people had to be in those days to make a dime and stay in business. Because the cotton grade is a very technical thing. I can't explain it too well myself, but the cotton buyer, or the cotton sampler, would go to the wagon and yank him out a little lint with seed, and he'd spread that out. Now, they tell me that D.R. Owens had a thumb that measured cotton, that when the cotton lint from that seed went over a certain portion of his thumb, that was the grade of cotton that he bought. If it didn't, why, he wouldn't buy it. But there were a lot of different ways. They'd twist the cotton on both sides of the seed as far as that lint would go. That gave you the staple, the full length of that on each side, and that would balance on, if it were practically the same on both sides, then your cotton would be what you'd call a strict Midland grade, because the cotton was balanced and had that same staple. The staple of the cotton was why they were very particular in those early days of getting the same grade of cotton each year. And in through this section of the country, we had about 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch staple cotton. Of course, that cotton was, so much of it was brought in, the seed was brought into this country, of course, from the South, and their seed was of that same staple quality. Well, the point I was trying to make about the cotton buyer, he had to buy that cotton almost by sight and his instinct. And that was practically the major thing why cotton was so competitive. Because one fellow would come along and give that same farmer that had been graded prior by another cotton buyer a little better grade, and maybe 2 cents a pound or something like that, a little better price to get his cotton in their gin. Well, those things went on, of course, constantly, and the cotton buyer had to be pretty sharp, and he had to be pretty truthful too, because his cotton was later sampled, and they'd take those samples out of the bale after it was baled, and they were sent to the larger compresses or the storage areas in the larger cities on big long tables. They'd probably be as long as this room, and they'd have big sections of this cotton already out there for the buyers from the east to come through and pick out his quality of cotton that he liked. Well, that cotton had to stand up, that grade had to stand up all the way through from the farmer's wagon clear back to the mill. And a lot of times that's why we had so many gin and cotton buyers that didn't stay in business, because they either weren't particularly honest or their grade judgment wasn't accurate enough to keep them out of trouble. I think that pretty nearly covers the bigger part of my paper. I've skipped through as best I could to cut the time down. And of course, here's a little item that D.R. Owens had a very severe hand injury while working in the gin. As I mentioned earlier, cotton gins were of complex mechanical nature, and in the early days they had to start this machinery with steam-powered motors. And this old fellow down by the depot, still living by the name of Schaefer, used to fire a good many of those boilers. And he'd just make a circle around from one gin to another to keep that steam pressure up. Well, the funny thing about it is the saws in these gin stands have to be revolved at a certain speed to split that cotton from the seed clean. And the moment that motor were to slow down, why, those saws would become a little bit gummed up. Well, that's where people got hurt pretty bad in those early days, was reaching into those. They'd lift a gin stand lid up to clean that cotton out, and if they weren't careful, they'd lose a hand or so in those saws. There'd be about 60 saws on each stand as that cotton was run through, and the lint went through one channel and the seed went out another. Of course, the seed wasn't of any particular value, and neither were the hulls in those early days. But the cotton went on through to a big compress that had a tremendous pressure on it, and that's how they baled the cotton into that square. But I thought I'd mention that on account of we've had a number of folks that have seen Price Walters and a number of the old-timers that have lost a limb or a hand in these. Yes, and Leonard Bert's father. And so those things couldn't be controlled very well because naturally a fellow was at work in that business. He wanted to help get his farm, his cotton through the gin. Of course, I could have spent a good many minutes in explaining some of the early day cotton prices, but we're running out of time, and I'll just simply state that in the very early days, if I recall, cotton picking and cotton chopping was priced as low as 25 or 30 cents an hour. And it wasn't until about 1919 that the price of cotton picking per hundredweight went to 75 cents, and then a little later went to $1. Now the reason for those later prices being so high was on account of this cotton weevil. The weevil came into this country about 25 or 26. It was a red or pink.
21.
Was it that or?
21.
It was a pink worm that got into the bowl early in the season and would sting a hole in it. This cotton would come out and produce itself as a white cotton, but it would leave an awfully bad stain, and it was awfully hard to gin. That is, cotton was clean. If it were clean cotton, it came out nice and white. But this cotton that had the weevil sting would come out with a yellow, very yellow, noticeable stain. And that lowered our prices of cotton, and it was a very difficult thing to pick out of the bowl because it was inclined to stick in the bowl with that weevil sting in it. So they began to just pull the bowl and all. They just called that snapping the cotton. They used to pick it clean, as you yourselves have seen cotton picked and piled in the wagons. But this was just stripped off bowl and all. And the gins then had to resort to electrical power to put enough power onto their machinery to tear that cotton out of the bowl and away from the seed. That's why there's another reason why this country had to become slowed down in the development of cotton. Of course, the prices on cotton didn't vary very much as far as the farmer got. He might get 4 or 5 cents, and I think Mr. Ross Crane said that 7 cents was a very dependable and pretty good price for cotton in those early days. That is, that would be about $35 a bale. Well, of course, if you had a large enough family in those days, the cotton picking and chopping didn't cost you very much. But a lot of that had to, of course, come out of the farmer's pocket. And his case then, of course, naturally depended on how much of that labor he had to pay for. Of course, cotton price today will run about 32 cents. That is the lint cotton itself. The seed is of value now, and so are the hulls. There are a number of different processes that they put cotton into now that has made it a little more valuable than it was in the early days. More machinery handles it, and there's been more fertilizer come from the hulls, and the seed processes the oil. Now, to step back a moment, back in those early days, this old cotton oil mill crushed this seed and made oil that's used for cooking and a lot of other purposes, oil mixed with paints and other things. Then they also used the residue of that seed into a ground up meal. That is, that seed, after the oil had been pressed from it, left enough there for them to cook. And they put those seed in a very large wide pan into ovens and let them cook. Now, Judd Balcom formerly used to be a Chandler man here, was superintendent of that particular part of the mill, and they would have maybe 40 or 50 colored men in those big ovens every day. They'd bake that maybe all night, and they'd take those large pans out and dump them, and then that residue was ground up for cottonseed oil meal or cake. and that was cattle feed. And they had an awfully lot of that oil and cottonseed cake in both Stroud, Chandler, and Prague in those early days. And of course, as our cotton diminished here, those mills have all discontinued. And at present, there's only one cotton gin that's of what they call operating in Lincoln County, and that's down at Prague. Now, I weighed a few loads of cotton while I was down at the old plant several years ago, and I asked the fellow where he intended to have his cotton gin. Well, he said he hadn't found a gin so far, but he thought he would go to McLeod. And I guess McLeod is about the nearest gin outside of Lincoln County that we have operating at this time. At one time in this county there were 50 gins. That's not counting the township gins like one or two down around Clifton or maybe one or two up in the northeast northwest part of the county that were actually located right out in the farmer's field. That is, these gins, and this Mrs. Rackley that lives here told me of an early day gin down near Clifton that her father operated back in those early days, that there would be so much acreage available at this particular part of the country that a gin was feasible. And the roads to the other gins, there just weren't enough roads for them to get their cotton to the market. So these gins were located around at different places in the county. Besides this 50 that I mentioned, there were 7 operating here in Chandler, 3 or 4 in Davenport, 2 or 3 in Wellston, and so on. But I believe my 30 minutes is up, and should anyone like to continue with this and further the report, it would be appreciated, and they can make some typewritten sheets for you to complete that report, I think.
George, I think you've done a marvelous job. You've been hearing George Dawson speak before the Lincoln County Historical Society in the museum building on the first day of April 1960. Let's give him another applause. Let me stop this.
Remember the first time we picked cotton here, and it was
Benny Kent's.
Yes,
I started.
that was right out here across from the old elder's place, and we picked all day long out there. And when night came, we were so tired we couldn't hardly move. And I said I was going to pick 100 pounds if I had to stay there all night. Well, I picked 100 pounds, but the last I dragged up there, I couldn't hardly get it up. And the next day or two, I was in bed.
How many of you folks ever pick cotton? How many haven't picked cotton? I saw two hands. Who's picked 100 pounds? Who's picked 200 pounds? Who's picked 300 pounds in one day?
I picked all day long.
Beulah, get up and tell him how many pounds you picked. Let's get to her. How many pounds you picked, Beulah?
The fall that I was 12 years old, I picked 306.
Who else has something to say?
Well, go on.
Pounds in one afternoon. How long will this continue? Let's stop this.
Just as long as you would like to hear some reports from others.
Oh, well, folks, this tape recorder is on here. And, George, you have anything else to say?
Wonder if that picture's been returned.
I wonder. Well, folks, we've had a most wonderful time tonight. How many folks are here? About 30 people are here tonight. I'll be that's enough.
Harry Poole, will you come up here, please? Quite fast. Harry Poole. He's from Acre. He's telling me this afternoon something about cotton. Harry, what did you tell me this afternoon about this cotton?
Well, now, Carney, I just said as a small boy, I just remember being here on these streets here, and the cotton wagons would be lined up for at least 2 blocks along here. And the buyers from the various gins would come along, climb up on the wagon and look at this cotton, and then they'd write you out a little ticket, make a price, tell what they'd give for that cotton, the name of the gin, you know, where it was, and they'd be maybe 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 different fellas come along and give you those prices. But I just want to say one thing, Carney, and listen to his talk there. You're talking about the cotton, the price of it in the early day, and the seed one time, you know, was just about completely worthless. There was a cotton gin a mile west and about a half a mile south of Parkland, and it was built right on that creek. That cotton seed was blowed right in the creek because it was of no value. Now, they'd catch your seed for you, but they didn't nobody want none, only just enough to take home to plant. And some people would take a load home and throw it out on the ground for fertilizer and plow it under, but they didn't want the cattle to get to it because one time they thought it was dangerous. It was a little bit dangerous for cattle to eat. Some people thought they lost some cattle of it. And then he mentioned about planting cotton. Davis City, which was 3 miles east of where Agri is now, that was one of the first little west, yes, that there was in the north part of the county. And there was 2 brothers that run a blacksmith shop there that made a cotton planter. They made out of 2 wagon wheels with axle and put shafts in it and built a platform on it, fastened a plow beam to it with a V that they made out of iron in there, with a spout down there and a hopper out of an old bucket, and had a place up here where a man could set up there with a bucket full of cotton seed and drop it in that and just go on, and that was planting cotton, boy.
Will you swear to that? I didn't see it. Oh, fine. Well, that's mighty fine. Now, who else here wants to say something about cotton?
Carney D, my sister and I, we have rode the wagon with Papa and Mama to Shawnee with cotton $20 to market.
Well, thank you, Miss Hill.
And then our mother drove an ox team from down near Purcell over here where we live now, with us little children.
Oh,
in the early days.
That's wonderful. Mrs. Love, do you have anything to say? On a cotton wagon?
Taking a load of cotton.
Thank you, Ms. Love.
Stay all night on the road, you know. It was a halfway house.
Charlie Hall, do you have anything to say?
It's about 2 days.
Get up here.
This is not Lincoln County, but to show you a disaster.
Come on.
I saw in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, I saw 20,000 bales of cotton on fire at the compress, just on a big platform and on the ground at the cotton compress. There were 20,000 bales there that was on fire, and they all burned up. They couldn't put the fire out. They got rid of a lot of them. They got to take a lot of them out. But there was 20,000 bales there that burned one Sunday afternoon.
Thank you, Charlie Hall. Tom Daniel, do you have anything to say? Come up here.
I don't think I have anything.
Mr. Ross Crane, we've been taking you. Come up here. Come on, come up here and say something. Anyone else now to say something on this program tonight? Okay.
I want to warn Carney not to offer a challenge to people because somebody's bound to take him up. He said, and this is Margaret Williams speaking, I'm in charge of the court recorder. He asked Mr. Poole if he could swear to that homemade cotton planter that Mr. Poole told about worked, and I can swear to it. I happen to know who made it and all about it, and it seems a strange coincidence that he told of that when I hadn't known that anybody remembered it but ourselves. The 2 brothers he told of were my father Eugene Dye and his brother, and at that time we lived in the Columbia School District. Our neighbors to the east were the Hollands. We were north of Kiefer's, and we adjoined Ori Long's home place on the south.
We had a wonderful neighborhood, I remember. Now, Papa didn't have this blacksmith shop as a business at all. He worked in the field all day long, and at night that was his relaxation, you might say, and they did it as a hobby mostly. And all the people came there, flocked there, the neighbors, and he did all their blacksmithing. We children would be delighted listeners and viewers of an evening, sitting out there and seeing the sparks fly and hearing the tall tales they told even in those days. I didn't mean to take so much time telling it. This is a sort of a postscript to the foregoing. This is a later date. I'm indexing the records, and I played them back, and I want to account for the long space that's open in the record earlier. We took a recording of a nice member that evening, and when she heard her voice played back, she begged us to delete it, and so we did. The rest of the reel is open.